Well, thank you, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to get a little misty-eyed talking about the cabinet shop, which is just to my right. I do hope that later today you'll take the opportunity to visit the shop, meet Chris, and just revel in this day, which represents the culmination of a multi-year effort to build that cabinet shop. Now, you might ask yourself, why would Sturbridge Village invest its funds in constructing a cabinet shop? And the story of the construction of this cabinet shop can be traced back to a book which Derek mentioned, a book that Christy Jackson, Clark Pierce, and myself had the opportunity to write, a book which was published in 2018, 3 years ago. And really, it was that book that propelled this cabinet shop project forward. Now, the reason this book plays a very special role in this cabinet shop is that the book itself, and I have a copy of it right here, looks at one particular cabinet maker and a circle of craftsmen who worked near him or with him. And this one man, Nathan Lombard. Nathan Lombard was born in Brimfield, just a few miles away. He actually trained here in Sturbridge, probably with Oliver White. And I'm sure many of you know the Oliver White House, which is part of the Old Sturbridge Village Lodges complex on Route 20. The builder of that house, Oliver White, almost certainly trained Nathan Lombard. Lombard worked in that shop for about 5 years, from 1798 to 1802. And during that brief period of time, produced some of the finest rural furniture made anywhere in New England. Certainly his masterpiece is this desk and bookcase, which is now at the Winterthur Museum. And you see a detail of one of the doors of that desk and bookcase on the right side of the screen. This is a tour de force of cabinet making produced by a gentleman who is in his early 20s at the time that he made this, probably around the year 1798 or 1799. What's remarkable is he's producing this piece in a cabinet shop behind the Oliver White House, just a half a mile from where we're sitting right now. And the story gets even more interesting when you take into consideration this dwelling, which no longer survives, but in fact, the entire village, Old Sturbridge Village, is now placed on the farm that the owner of this house built. This was the home of David White, Jr., Oliver White's brother. And this house was built in 1798, 1799. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Oliver White Tavern here as you came into the village. And directly behind the Oliver White Tavern, which is a new building, there is a much smaller building known by folks here at the village as the David White Cottage. Well, that cottage is actually the earlier home of David White, Jr. He replaced that cottage with this grander structure in 1798-99. Unfortunately, this building burned to the ground in 1929. But it was indeed his property that ultimately the Wells family acquires to create Old Sturbridge Village. And again, to take us back to Nathan Lombard, this remarkable cabinet maker, in doing the research for the book that Clark, Christy, and I produced, we came across a piece of furniture that had a pencil inscription on the underside of one of the drawers. I don't know whether you can make it out. D. White, Jr. We were perplexed at the time. We didn't know what this referred to. Now, this inscription appears on the underside of this small drawer in what is an extraordinary candle stand. And there it is. I will tell you, just for those of you that follow the marketplace, this stand brought almost $500,000 when it came up for sale a number of years ago. And as you can see, it's in a private collection. The center of that stand has an urn that is set into it. And on that urn is the date 1800. And indeed, our David White Jr., who built that great mansion that you saw a few moments ago in 1798 and 99, he also acquired this candle stand from Nathan Lombard a year after he had built the mansion. As we continued to do research, we discovered two other pieces, extraordinary pieces of New England furniture that also had that exact same inscription, D. White Jr., for David White Jr. All of these grand objects owned by David White. Just one footnote to all of this. David White, you might ask yourself, why does he go on a binge, build this great house, purchase this expensive furniture? And the answer is something that I think we can all relate to. I know all of you are familiar with the Massachusetts State Lottery. Well, David White Jr. won the lottery in 1796. It was a Harvard College lottery, and from the $5,000 that he received as the winning portion of his lottery ticket, which he, I should also add, had to borrow the $10 to buy that lottery ticket from his father. He didn't have the money, and he very generously gave his father $2,000 of that winning proceeds, but he kept $3,000 for himself, built the house, bought the furniture. It's an incredible story, and we tell that tale in the book. Well, in addition to Lombard, there were other craftsmen working right here in the Sturbridge area in the same time period, producing extraordinary furniture. One of the pieces we highlighted in the book is this grand sideboard with decorative inlays. That central door slides open, just as the one which you see here to my left. We focus on this piece, we devote a lot of attention to it, but when we published the book 3 years ago, we were not aware of the sideboard that you see to my left. This was a discovery of only the last year. It came up in November of 2020, and you'll hear more about the sideboard from Clark and from Chris. But there can be no question that this sideboard and the one which you just saw on the screen were made by the same individual. We don't know who it was. We know that the previous sideboard was owned by the Plimpton family, who lived in what is now Southbridge. So it's very local. They later moved to the Hartford area. But we believe that this sideboard, and indeed the one I showed you on the screen previously, were made somewhere in the Sturbridge, Southbridge, Charlton, somewhere in this part of the world. And they are incredibly sophisticated objects. And just to make that point, I want to call out one tiny detail. And you'll have a chance after the talks today, you can come up and take a look at the piece, and you can see that the feet on the sideboard have this decorative carving. I hope you can see it in that image on the right. Now, the sideboard that we featured in the book also has that decorative carving, and you may think, who cares? Why get so hot and bothered about a little detail like that? Well, it's when you track the origins of that detail, and you realize that the detail on this sideboard actually comes from a specific pattern book published in London In 1793, Thomas Sheraton, a British furniture maker and designer, publishes the Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Drawing Book. And in the 1793 edition, he shows you designs for what he describes as pilasters. But if you look in closely at that particular foot, and I blew it up there in the center of the screen, it is a dead ringer for the foot on the sideboard to the right, to my left, to your right, which tells us something quite extraordinary, that an individual here in the Sturbridge area had access to a London pattern book and was imitating the most stylish designs in London in the 1790s. It is a remarkable tale of rural furniture making. And just finally, two brief comments about sideboards, such as the one which you see here. Sideboards come into their own as forms of furniture that any affluent member of society, whether you were in Boston or in Sturbridge, would want to have in their house in the 1790s. It becomes a very fashionable and necessary accoutrement to your house. Here you see a picture from the Harrison Gray Otis house, now owned by Historic New England in Boston. You can see the use of the sideboard as a display space for dining paraphernalia. Also, the cabinets would hold bottles or tablewares. So it's a very significant piece of furniture for the dining room in the 1790s and the early 1800s. It's also a very expensive piece of furniture. And I just show you here, just to give you a sense of what it might have cost in terms of 1801 dollars to build a piece like the one which you see on the screen. Now, these are details on the right of the costs for building a sideboard. These are taken from a Salem, Massachusetts price book of 1801, and I show you a London price guide on the left. These were often published in major cities, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, London, but there was also one published in Salem in 1801, which is the closest comparison in terms of getting a sense of the cost of one of these to the sideboard which we have here in the meeting house. But if you look at the middle reference, which refers to a sideboard, ditto, scalloped front, which would be the shape that we see here, with a secretary drawer. Now that's a desk drawer in the top drawer in the center. This one does not have the desk drawer, so it would be the example at the bottom, without a secretary drawer, decorated and finished, $50. $50. I think you'd pay $50 for that today. But what's interesting is that the making of that, the cost of making it, was less than a third. $15 would have been paid to the craftsman to build this. The rest of that money, the $35, would have gone towards the materials, the mahogany, the white pine, the brass hardware, and a little bit of profit on top of that. So just as a comparison, a great desk and bookcase might cost $60 or $70. A clock, a tall clock, would cost $60. These were very expensive pieces of furniture at their time. Well, the acquisition of this piece last November for Old Sturbridge Village is a cause for celebration. The building of the cabinet shop is a cause for celebration. And I just want to say congratulations to Old Sturbridge Village. And I wouldn't be doing my job as a trustee of Old Sturbridge Village if I didn't make a pitch. And the pitch is simply this. Sturbridge has raised a tremendous amount of money to build that shop. But it still is going to need resources to keep the shop going, active, keep craftsmen in there doing their job. And I have in my hands the author's copy of the Lombard book that Clark and I and Christy would gladly sign and give to anyone who would like to donate $1,000 to the cabinet making operation at Old Sturbridge Village. And I'll even throw in a special opportunity because, you know, I can get you 2 copies of this for just $1,000. And there's more. If you come see me at Winterthur Museum, I will give you a tour behind the scenes, and some here have done it. You will never regret it. I'll get you lost in the museum. You'll never find your way out. Anyway, thank you all very much. I'm going to turn things over to Clark, and I'm so glad you're here today. Thank you.
And I'm here to talk today about the conservation of this wonderful sideboard that Brock has so well put into context for us, pitch and all. So anyway, that's what I'm here to do. One morning last November, I was having my morning coffee, sitting at the kitchen table, perusing the latest issue of Antiques in the Arts Weekly, otherwise known to us as The Bee. An auction advertisement caught my eye because it illustrated a fuzzy photo, about 2 inches square, of a sideboard that looked very familiar to me. It was similar to the sideboard from the Plimpton family of Southbridge that Brock just illustrated. I instantly knew that I had to track this piece down. I called Brock, and the rest was history. When I got to the warehouse the next day to look at the sideboard, I was thrilled because it related so closely to the sideboard that Brock just spoke about and that we had studied so intensively. It had a good chance of having been made by the same anonymous cabinet maker who made the Plimpton sideboard, who was part of the greater circle of cabinet makers around Nathan Lombard of Sturbridge and Sutton. I was greatly relieved at first look because it seemed to be in relatively good condition. After 2 hours of examination and many photos, I concluded that while there were no deal breakers, the piece had been used constantly and hard for 220 years. And needed a lot of skilled conservation by a professional. The good news is that it was certainly by the same hand as the Plimpton sideboard, which we've just discussed. After Old Sturbridge purchased the piece, I took it to the conservation studio of Melissa Carr for a closer look. She's one of a handful of outstanding furniture conservators in the state, having worked for Robert Muzzy when he started a conservation lab in the barn of the Lyman estate all the way back in 1982. There, she and I spent hours sticking little pieces of blue tape on all the places that needed attention, from tiny veneer losses to the structure of the legs and more. So this is the sideboard as I saw it in the warehouse. And it was a very dark warehouse. I had to blow the image up and add light so you could see what it looked like. Same piece, obviously, that's right over there. This is how it looked when I first saw it. So, talking about the condition and the conservation, let's start with the structural work. The rear legs on the piece had been broken and cracked and repaired. After the repairs were done by an anonymous cabinet maker, these wrought iron, hand-wrought L brackets were added to add strength to the piece. The good news is that the cabinet maker had done a good job. When we took the brace off, everything was sound. We didn't have to go in and do any more work on it. That was the great news. But what we did have to do is that the screws that held on the L bracket were big fat screws, and they created a big hole. And that hole creates a weakness. And there's like, 10 different screws there. So Melissa filled those in with a really stiff putty so that, as the piece was moved around or maybe, God forbid, dragged along the floor, it didn't re-break. So this is a view looking under the leg on this side. And up here, see if I can get my little laser thing to work here. There we go. Oop, I'm hitting the wrong thing. Where is it, Derek?
It's that one right there.
Oh, that one, okay, thanks. Okay, so this is the area where the leg was broken. And you can just make out that there's a big tenon there that was added that went up into the structure of the case to secure that leg. This is the other leg, which I hope you can see. There are many different cracks and patches that go into this area that were done at the time of the restoration to stabilize the piece. And like I say, it was great news because we didn't have to take all that apart and re-glue it, which would have been a huge job. There were a lot of veneer losses on the piece, and you can see one right here. And here's our trusty blue tape that we talk about. This piece is very unusual because the substrate is cherry, as we would expect it to be. But the whole surface is covered with mahogany veneer, which is very unusual in this whole group of furniture that comes out of this area. Almost everything is cherry, and cherry is the primary wood as well as the secondary wood. But in this case, the cabinet maker and the person who commissioned it, who we don't know who that is, surely was showing off a little by having the cabinet maker veneer the whole piece in mahogany. Now, mahogany has to be shipped, obviously, from the Caribbean or Boston or Providence, and it's a long cart ride from Providence or Boston with mahogany logs. So the mahogany was just basically not used in this area, except for very few pieces, and those pieces were the most expensive, obviously. But this cabinet maker was not familiar with basic structure and how to apply veneer. He's applying this mahogany veneer crosswise, in other words, cross banding. So you have the structure of the leg, the cherry leg, and then on top of that, you're putting the veneer across. And it makes a very interesting decorative look. But the problem is that with atmospheric conditions, with the shrinking and swelling, that bond doesn't hold very well. So many of the pieces of veneer had fallen off. Now, because this piece was used hard and pretty roughly, there are a lot of other kinds of losses. And I hope you can see that the stringing, there should be a light stringing next to a dark stringing next to a light stringing that forms a band that goes up and down the corners of the leg. In this photograph, you can see that only this section of the outer light band is there. From here down, all the way down to here, and then this whole side over here, that stringing is missing. You can sort of see the arrows are pointing to that loss. So that's the kind of thing that Melissa had to repair. And here it is, the same leg, and you can see the arrows are pointing to the very white stringing that had to be added where it was lost. I actually take it back. It's not the same leg, but it's a different leg. And there's our trusty blue tape acting as a clamp to hold all that stringing in. Now, the sideboard's brasses are actually reproductions. They're probably early 20th century reproductions. Fortunately, they're so similar to the ones that were there, and we can tell that by the evidence underneath these, that the decision was made not to replace these. Save a little money that way. But the problem was that the three drawers across the top of the sideboard had brasses on them. But the doors on the ends of the cupboards did not have brasses on them. So this brass right here was added for convenience, much easier to open the door. Previously, you would have opened the door by a key that was just left in the keyhole, and that acts as a handle. But they added these guys, and it's a real problem because they had to be taken off because they didn't belong there. And this is what's under that. And you can see that there are two big holes and a very dark circle where the brass covered all that up. So they had to come off. The good news is that this color right here, which is an old color, and it really helped us to know what the color should look like, when it's finished. This piece was very badly sun faded, so the color that you see in these photographs was unacceptable. It was bleached and kind of yellow and very dried out. Anyway, there's the same door, and you can see that and you can see it over here on the actual sideboard too. That big dark circle's disappeared, the hole has disappeared, and the color's been totally corrected. So this is a photograph of the top of the sideboard as it was when we first saw it. Very sun-bleached. The wood looked yellow. The grain was very open and dry because the sun bleaching had really damaged some of the wood on the top. This must have sat in a window for decades, with the sun just beating on it every day, and it didn't do it any favors. So this is a picture of that, just like that, but you can see that the top has been restored to its original color. And I should say something about how that's done. The color is actually mixed with, it's a dye that's mixed with shellac and then applied in very, very thin layers until you get the color you want. You never use pigments in a shellac to get that color because pigments are opaque and they will totally obscure the grain of the wood. You would just see brown color. You wouldn't see any of the wood coming through. This is another image, a close-up of the left-hand side of the drawer, the top drawer in the center. And you can see that it's just bleached and nasty, and the grain is open, and it's got this horrible yellowish color to it, and the whole piece had to have, be treated for color correction. So this is a picture this is an after treatment picture, which shows that same area right up on the center drawer left there. You see how well it came out, and you can see that there's the pores have been filled. There's good finish still back on it, and the color is quite beautiful. So here's the finished piece, and there's the finished piece, and that is a little tale of the conservation of the sideboard. I could go on and on, of course. There's way more that went into it, but I think this is a good overview so you don't have to be bored to go through the whole thing. Anyway, my one hope, or my one wish, is that Melissa Carr could be here to hear a round of applause for the amazing job that she did. So, here's to Melissa.
Hello, I'm Chris Nassis. I'm going to talk about some of the construction details in the sideboard here. So as you all know, this morning we have the grand opening of our new cabinet making shop. The opening of this exhibit represents years of planning, research, fundraising, coordination, construction, and craftsmanship. This new interpretive space will bring the world of the 19th century rural New England cabinet maker to life. Cabinet makers working in this shop will use the tools and the same patterns of those that were used in the period. We'll study and build period furniture in an effort to better understand the skills and methods employed by cabinet makers in central Massachusetts during this time. We'll also continue our research into the rich history of local furniture makers, such as Oliver Wight and Nathan Lombard, whose exceptional craftsmanship inspired the revival of cabinet making here at the museum. All the work leading up to this opening and all the efforts that will continue long into the future are intended to help preserve the traditions of a historic trade. As we discover more about the world of the 19th century cabinet maker through our work, we'll teach the larger community about how they lived and how they worked. I had all those thoughts in mind when I was examining this stunning sideboard for the first time. I considered the challenges of design, materials, and construction in such an ambitious piece of furniture. I wanted to better understand how the artisan who produced this extraordinary example of rural craftsmanship navigated these challenges. In terms of design, sideboards are a bold statement of elegance and affluence, and they're designed to display costly household articles in a grand fashion. The large drawers and the cabinets also provide a place for storing table linens, dishes, and silver. The commanding scale of the Sturbridge sideboard, as well as the dramatic curves of the mahogany top, the cabinet doors, and the serpentine drawer fronts, all contribute to the grandeur of this example of the newest fashion. As Clark mentioned, imported mahogany was scarce in central Massachusetts in the early part of the 19th century, and was, however, cherry and white pine was in abundance in the region, which made these the primary and secondary woods of choice for casework. Oliver Wight's family owned a sawmill on the Quinnebog River near the site of the water-powered mill here at the village. And the Whites and other mill owners in the Sturbridge area likely provided wood for cabinet makers in these native species. So the sideboard that you see from the exterior is beautifully veneered in mahogany, but almost the entire piece is constructed of pine and cherry. So the case, the door, the drawer construction are all made of pine. The top is solid mahogany, and some of the applied details, such as the moldings, are also mahogany. The legs are cherry and veneered with a cross-banded veneer applied in a horizontal orientation that Clark detailed in his presentation. The reason for this arrangement was of a lot of interest to the group. We discussed why some of these pieces of veneer would have been placed in a horizontal position. And it may have been to blend the grain of the legs with the grain of the side of the case. It also could have been just a lack of understanding of the material and the fact that it would probably fail over time. Let's move the slide here. So it was interesting to me that in the left-hand side of the case and the right-hand side of the case, there's a crack that appears in almost the exact same position on both sides of the case. So the sideboard, or sideboards in general, are constructed in a way where the case sides run horizontally to the vertical direction of the legs. So across that really tremendous distance, you have to join the case side to the leg in a way that will allow that board to expand and contract over time as humidity changes the dimension of the material. And in this particular example, there's a crack on this side and the other side, and that possibly had to do with the structure of the joinery, that over time the movement of the wood forced the boards to split. It also could have something to do with the extensive amount of glue blocks that are on the interior of the piece that are holding all the framework together. Those may have disrupted the ability for the joinery to expand and contract. This is the opposite side. You can see that they're pretty much in the same position. This is a detail of the cross-banded veneer that runs in the same direction. The grain structure is running in the same direction as the case side. This is a detail of the interior of the case. You can see that clearly the pine interior, and in the far corner there, what you're looking at is the rear left leg, and you can see the series of glue blocks that are attached in the back there. This is a detail of the underside of the piece, and the underside is composed of a very large series of pine boards. So you have 3 boards, one in one corner, one in the central section, and one in the far corner. And those are nailed into the framework from the underside and attached to cleats as well on the underside. So pretty massive piece of wood, but fairly straightforward construction. Here's a detail that shows the rail structure that connects between the 2 legs and the layers of applied wood that build out the curves in the front of the sideboard. The drawers, this dramatic swelled curve on the draw fronts. The drawers are also constructed of pine, and they're made from a series of layers of wood that are stacked up on top of each other, and then the front is veneered. So in this image here, see if I can find the laser pointer. Is this guy here? Okay. Yep. So there's, it might be hard to see back there, but there's very clearly lines here that show what the layers of wood that are on the interior of the draw front. And when you look at the draws from the outside, you can see the beautiful veneering that's applied to the core, and it's a completely different appearance. The veneer, the delicate veneer on the edges of the draw front is protected by mahogany strips, and these strips, called caulk beading, are shaped and applied along the edge of the drawer. That protects the veneer from chipping and also gives a nice shadow line. So this is a detail of the dovetails in the rear of one of the drawers, and I was struck by the skill of the craftsman in terms of cutting the joinery, in that the pins go to just the width of a saw blade. So very, very finely cut joinery. And then I was also, that was sort of, the counterpoint to that was the speed at which the craftsman was working, because you can see a tremendous number of overcuts where there wasn't, it was efficient work and quick work. This was necessary to join the drawer together, but it wasn't fussy work. And still, the the dovetails look fantastic, even at a quick pace. The draw bottoms here, you can see, also are pine, and there's a groove that runs around the sides and the front of the drawer, and a very crude bevel is cut into the draw bottom to allow the draw bottom to slide into the groove that runs around the perimeter of the drawer. And then there's a series of glue blocks that are applied to the draw bottom to strengthen that construction. So a very innovative solution is used for the doors. The really dramatic curve of the doors are constructed by a series of vertical pine boards. And you can see these, you can see the evidence of these individual boards that are running up and down. And the edges are beveled similar to the way a cooper will bevel the edges of a bucket to form the curve. And above and below, up here and down here, is a horizontal breadboard style end that holds the whole construction together. But from the front, that whole method of construction is nearly invisible. So the whole piece is decorated with a number of decorative elements. This is an example of stringing. I brought a few samples with me here today. This is a piece of stringing that would be inlaid into a piece like this sideboard, and it's a very, very thin strip of veneer. And the way that these lines that run horizontally along the edge of the case top, the way those are cut in is with a tool called a scratch stock. So this is a very, very simple tool. It's just 2 blocks of wood that an L-shaped notch is cut out of, and a metal cutter is placed in between there. And you test the cutter on a piece of wood and check to see if your veneer will fit into that channel that you've scratched. And if that channel isn't wide enough, you file it down a little bit until you can get a perfect fit for the thickness of the veneer that you've cut. So once this piece is inlaid into the piece, it's then flushed up and made to be uniform with the surface, so it becomes the method that was used to inlay the pieces is nearly invisible. So I also have a few other samples here with me of, just see what the next, so in this slide you can see a banding that wraps around the edge of the foot, of the leg, excuse me. And that's another series of built-up veneers. So there's on this particular banding, I have a piece of wood that, this is the end grain here, and the board would extend long grain in this direction. And veneers are applied on top of that piece of wood, and then this is sliced into very, very thin sections, and the resulting decorative element is a very small little banding that can be applied or inlaid into a piece. So I've just got a couple of other items here. So this is a piece of mahogany veneer, a similar pattern to the one that's used on the sideboard. It just gives you an idea of how small that piece of mahogany actually is, or thin, I should say. And these are 2 more pieces of veneer that are, this is a dyed veneer, and this would be how these layers of banding are formed. The veneer is glued onto a piece of solid wood and then sliced to create those decorative elements. The last little piece that I have is a shaded piece of veneer. This is sand shaded, so the piece of veneer is put into a plate of hot sand, and the sand singes the edges, creating an interesting shadow effect on the veneer, and details can be cut out from a small piece like this to create 3 dimensions in the inlay on the piece. So this is a detail of the beautiful carving on the foot. And inlaid bellflowers. Bellflowers were a classic motif that was used in a lot of furniture of this style. Again, veneers that are cut to fit the inlay. All right, I think that we're going to have an opportunity now to come up and take a closer look at the piece, but thank you.